This is ABC News legal analyst Royal Oakes welcoming you to Hinshaw Culbertson's Insurance Law Program, where we discuss insurance and reinsurance issues of interest to industry professionals. Here's your host, the co-chair of Hinshaw's Global Insurance Services Practice Group, Scott Seaman.
Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us on Insurance Law. I'm Scott Seaman, and on this episode of Insurance Law, we will be discussing ESG, sometimes referred to as sustainability. Sometimes companies call it this all-consuming pain in the rear end. Others believe that it's the be-all and end-all of corporate existence these days. You will hear about ESG in the legal arena and business press and throughout the media, really. It's front and center on the minds of CEOs, boards, and business leaders. It is a topic that impacts all businesses. It impacts insurance companies in a variety of contexts, as businesses, as investors, as underwriters, and on the claims side as well. The Biden administration has employed what it calls an all-of-government approach to ESG, as have some states. And on this episode, we'll start out by talking about the basics, by defining and outlining what is encompassed within the term ESG. And joining us today, the smiley face on the screen, is Bessie Dashbach. She is a partner at Hinshaw Culbertson's New Orleans office, and we're so thrilled to have her and New Orleans as part of our footprint these days. She's a very experienced environmental lawyer, and she's quarterbacking our firm's multidisciplinary approach to ESG. So, Bessie, welcome, and thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you, Scott.
Bessie, ESG means different things to different people and really in different contexts. So probably a good place to start is to have you tell us what exactly ESG is.
Sure. At the highest level, ESG is really a set of standards that are going to be grounded in environmental, social, and/or governance considerations. And these standards are applied by stakeholders. And by stakeholders, I mean investors, lenders, customers, and even employees. They apply these standards to evaluate a business's material risks and also its growth opportunities. They ultimately use these to try to favorably distinguish businesses that are making positive contributions based on those considerations.
So somewhere along the line, I remember saying like something borrowed, something new, something blue. I think it's in the context of weddings, but in some ways ESG is new, but in other ways, it goes back for quite some time, doesn't it?
It does. While we're hearing a lot about it now, maybe more than we have in the past, really the idea of ESG reaches back as many as 20 years. The UN Secretary then, General Kofi Annan, invited something like 50 CEOs of major financial institutions to join together to find ways to really integrate ESG into capital markets. And then in 2005, there was the Freshfield Report, which showed that ESG issues are relevant for financial valuation. And then in 2006 and 2007, the Principles for Responsible Investment were launched at the New York Stock Exchange, along with the Sustainable Stock Exchange Initiative. And even since all that, I will say that ESG has really extended far beyond where it started then, which was largely in the financial space.
An ESG encompasses a host of what I'll call corporate practices, targets, objectives, and performance. Some even say it is or it should be part of a company's DNA. But let's break it down a little bit. There is an E, an S, and a G component. So what's the E component all about?
The E is the one we hear most about, at least most recently, and that's for environmental. So the E can capture efforts in areas like climate change, greenhouse gas emissions, carbon footprints, energy efficiencies, natural resource management, pollution mitigation, waste management, even water usage.
And so broadly speaking, it's how a company or an organization deals with the environment. Let's move on and cover the big old S. It doesn't stand for Scott. It stands for...
It stands for social. It encompasses areas that a lot of which are employment related, like labor standards, wages and benefits, workplace and board diversity, racial justice, pay equity, human rights, And because many of those are employment related, some have suggested that those should be encompassed under another E. But S also extends to things like community relations, privacy and data protection, health and safety, supply chain management, consumer protection, and even animal welfare.
And lastly, let's talk about the G.
Yeah, the G is for governance. And the way I think of it, Scott, is really the G is the governance of the E and the S. But in practice, it can refer to efforts in areas that include corporate board composition and structure, sustainability, oversight, and compliance, executive compensation, shareholder engagement, political contributions and lobbying, and even avoidance of bribery and corruption.
So, boy, you combine them all together, and there's not much that's not within all of the categories. And so if you do take all these things together and you talk about a business doing ESG, what are they actually doing?
Well, businesses will be folding any of these considerations and also how they meet them into any aspect of their business, and then they tell the public about it. And really, when we talk about ESG, this telling is the key part. And that telling could come in the form of product labels, websites, social media, marketing materials, and environmental reports, just to name a few. I will note that some of this reporting is voluntary, but some of it is increasingly becoming mandatory.
So with some of the elements being voluntary and others being mandatory or legal requirements, where do the legal requirement portions come from?
That's really evolving right now, Scott, both in the US and elsewhere. For example, you've probably heard about the Security and Exchange Commission's proposed rules calling for disclosure of climate-related risks and greenhouse gas emissions. But also the EU just recently issued the Corporate Sustainability and Reporting Directive, which will come into effect in 2024. And that really expands the reach of EU reporting obligations on both E and S issues. Most recently, also, Germany has established rules for reporting on supply chains that really reach deep into businesses' supply chains, and other countries are really coming online as well. I'll say the landscape is very dynamic, and it will be very important for businesses to keep an eye on how they might be effective. I'll also note that, for example, with the SEC, this could be true even for businesses that are not filing reports with the Securities and Exchange Commission. The proposed SEC rules, for example, could have both upstream and downstream effects, and even the EU and German rules could apply to businesses outside of the EU and Germany if those businesses meet certain specified criteria. In a word, businesses really need to rely on probably their counsel to determine whether they fall within nets that have been set and others that are very quickly developing.
Yeah, it's very quickly developing, and it is very broad. And as you mentioned, so company may not only be responsible for reporting its carbon emissions, it may be responsible for reporting those of others in its supply chain. And
Exactly.
I know it's a hot topic being discussed. But I'd say that for several years, the U.S. has lagged behind Europe on a lot of the ESG issues. But it seems like we're coming on very strong with the Biden administration's focus on ESG.
I think that is fair to say, Scott. I mean, regulation in Europe really continues to develop at a very quick clip. Just this month, France's financial market regulator, the AMF, released a proposal pushing for stricter rules on sustainable investments. And in the EU, just in the last few weeks, we've seen proposals for detailed rules outlining the definition of what constitutes renewable hydrogen, rules requiring a 90% emissions reduction for heavy trucks by 2040, and rules requiring all new cars in the EU to be zero emission by 2035. In fact, the EU is even relaxing antitrust rules to further efforts to combat climate change. So there's just a lot happening there, and very quickly. That said, the US has really turned strongly toward environmental, social, and governance issues. And it is indeed, I think, fair to say it is squarely front and center for us here at home now. Last year's passage of the Inflation Reduction Act will drive roughly $369 billion to climate-related initiatives. And the Uyghur Forced Labor Prevention Act is actually scheduled to go into effect June 21st. As you may know, that act establishes a rebuttable presumption that imports from the area were produced with forced labor. Now, All that said, I think much further legislation may be stuck in a deadlocked Congress for the near term, but I'll also add that US states are really starting to push ESG on their own, and notably against the anti-ESG wave that really marks the beginning of this year. Some states are moving ahead with their own rules to address sustainability concerns and lower greenhouse gas emissions, and much of those are not at all unlike the developments that we're seeing in Europe. For example, Minnesota's governor just signed legislation establishing a statewide carbon-free electricity standard, and New Jersey even announced a series of steps aimed at achieving 100% clean energy by 2035. Again, the landscape is very dynamic and demands a very watchful eye.
And even when the government's not involved demanding or compelling ESG, it seems like you have organizations such as rating agencies that are involved in looking and rating companies based on that. And you have a lot of pressure on companies effectively to become private attorneys general, if you will, in enforcing ESG standards on companies and others that they deal with. So it's it's come on fast and it's come on strong. Many companies for years, even when I was a young kid, prided themselves on either being socially responsible or what they would call good corporate citizens. But ESG embodies that, but it's not just a name or a new name for that concept, is it?
No, that's actually exactly right, Scott. I think if corporate social responsibility was what a business was doing internally, ESG is really what a business is doing internally, and again, whether and how that business is talking about it. ESG is also, in addition to that, about pressures on businesses that could be said to reflect a new understanding of corporate license. At the heart of the debate over ESG is really a debate about corporate purpose. Why does a corporation exist and whose interest does it exist to serve?
And Bessie, that's an interesting thought. What do you mean by that?
Well, for example, in 2018, the CEO of major asset manager BlackRock wrote a public letter describing the context for ESG this way. He said, "Society is demanding that companies, both public and private, serve a social purpose. To prosper over time, every company must not only deliver financial performance, but also show how it makes a positive contribution to society. Companies must benefit all of their stakeholders, including shareholders, employees, customers, and the communities in which they operate. Companies must ask themselves these questions. What role do they play in the community? How are we managing our impact on the environment? And are we working to create a diverse workforce?" That's according to Larry Fink of BlackRock, and he's issued a like letter every year since, and I'm sure you've seen that he's been squarely within the news over and over again in recent months. But I think it comes down to this, that in the current climate, companies that don't respond satisfactorily to the questions that Larry Fink outlined risk not only a generalized brand shaming, but they also risk losing funding, customers, and talent. They really could lose out on those markets. And I really think that is a step or even more beyond where CSR, corporate social responsibility, had taken us.
Well, given all of that, how would you sum up ESG for our listeners and viewers?
Well, I think the theory is that ESG is really where value and values overlap or can overlap, that businesses can use E, S, and G criteria to identify and evaluate not only material risks, but also growth opportunities. And while the concepts underlying ESG and even their enactment as policies and programs within businesses may not be new, see again CSR, the push to really communicate out what businesses are doing on those fronts, again, sometimes voluntarily and also increasingly because regulations require it, that pushing out is really something new. Put most simply, by doing good, businesses can do better, whether that is in securing funding, customer base, or talent. But as we're watching this develop, I'll really just add that businesses better do that right. And I really do think that's where lawyers can come in with good advice about how to actually do ESG and do it right.
I think that's so important. Whatever people's views may be on it, it is something that's going to determine the short-term and long-term success and viability of companies. And so you have to be on top of it. You have to do it right and know what doing it right means. And Bessie, thank you so much for joining us. We are just getting started on the subject of ESG. Bessie will be back in the next episode of Hinshaw Insurance Law, and we're going to take a deeper dive into ESG. We thank you for joining us and hope you will join us on the next episode of Insurance Law.
The information on our insurance law program is provided for general information purposes only. Nothing stated on the program constitutes legal advice or creates an attorney-client relationship. You should consult directly with an attorney of your choosing if you'd like to obtain any advice with respect to any claim, case, or matter. Any views expressed are those of the guests and are not necessarily the views of Hinshaw Culbertson or any of its clients. For information on past and upcoming programs, visit the Insurance and Reinsurance page on www.hinshawlaw.com and click on Multimedia.